Perek Yud Beis, Mishnah Hey. The Mishnah now contrasts with the previous Mishnah, where in the previous Mishnah, Mishnah Daled, we set out that in order to be chayav for kosev min haTorah, the mark, the impression which you make has to be a dover shemiskayim, something which endures. So now this Mishnah is going to set out instances where you write with things which a dover she'ena miskayim, which is not going to endure, and therefore min haTorah at least you're going to be potter for ksiva. Midrabanan, Chazal would still say it's asa, but min haTorah at least you're potter. So therefore says the Mishnah, kosav b'mashkin, if a person would write with liquids, the Bartanura says, this is referring to something which is mashchirin, some sort of raspberry juice, blueberry juice, which is mashchirin, which forms a black color. Or alternatively, says the Mishnah, b'mei peiros, with other fruit juice, shall kol shar peiros, says the Bartanura, with other types of fruit juice. If a person writes with this, and that's not considered the dover shemiskayim, and therefore you'll be potter for that. Similarly, ba'avak derachim, if a person writes with the dust which is on the road, so for example, the Bartanura says, kagoin, for example, shesorat be'etzba'oi tzuras oisius halachol v'ha'avak shebedrachim. The person writes, imagine dust has settled on some sort of dusty path in the road, and you write and you form a letter in the dust, you form out some sort of writing, then again that is dover she'ena miskayim, because when it rains or when the wind comes along, that's just going to blow it away. So therefore it's a dover she'ena miskayim, and therefore you're potter. Similarly, ba'avak hasoifrim, with the dust of soifrim. So the Bartanura says it's referring to afroria shel keses hasofer, which means that in the inkwell of the sofer, if the ink dries out and you've got some sort of residue at the bottom of the inkwell, if a person would write onto that, again you're potter because it's a dover she'ena miskayim. The Aruch learns that we're referring to when the sofer makes the ink. He takes all the ingredients together and he sort of crushes ingredients and pulverizes them, and therefore in the process some sort of dust settles around, and if a person writes in that dust, again it's a dover she'ena miskayim, and therefore he's potter. And this concludes the mission of Chol dover she'ena miskayim is potter. If anything which is ena miskayim is going to be potter. The article brings the Turei Zohov that if to form imaginary letters in the air, so just to write in the air or something like that, or even to write on a table, but just with your finger where you're making no indentation or no mark whatsoever, then in that situation that would be totally mutter even. Midrabanan, there'd be no problem over there either. If it was no indentation whatsoever. Okay, now the Mishnah is going to set out a list where there's another reason why you're going to be potter min haTorah, and that is that a person does the melacha of kosev kilachayad in an unusual manner. Just like we learned in Perek Yud, in the 10th Perek of Mishnah Gimel, with regard to Hotza'ah, that when a person carries in an unusual way, this is true for all melachas, that if a person does the melacha in an unusual way, then there is no chiyuv min haTorah, and min haTorah is potter. Midrabanan, Chazal made certain safeguards or whatever they slapped on an issa, but min haTorah a person would be potter. So therefore, if a person wrote la'acha yodai, he wrote with the back of his hand. So the Bartanura says, al gav yodai, the back of the hand, she'ochas hakumas be'etzbo isof. He took a pen in his hand, v'hofach yodai v'kosav. So for example, a person took a pen. Normally you write, of course, like that. But if a person turned his hand round and put the kulmas in like that, and he wrote in that fashion, that's considered kalachayad, and therefore he'd be potter for that. Baragloi, if alternatively he put the pen between his toes and he wrote like that, or bafiv, he put the pen in his mouth and he wrote with his head, or merapgoi, or he wrote with his elbow, he took the pen and he sort of put it between his elbow and he wrote like that, that's all considered kilachayad, and it's writing in an unusual form, and therefore, midaraisa at least, there is no chiyuv. Continues the Mishnah. Another sort of series where a person hasn't properly done the melacha of kosev, and therefore, again, he's going to be potter in all of these situations. Kosev ois achas somach lichsav. A person came along and he saw, for example, there was a letter there already. and he came along and just wrote one letter, and that completed a word or made the minimum share of two, again you're going to be potter for that, because he hasn't written two letters. He hasn't written the minimum amount for the malach of kosev on Shabbos. So kosev ois achas samach lichtav, he sort of adjoined, he wrote one letter only, even though he joined it up with another one, he's still potter. Kosev al gabi ksav, if he wrote one letter on top of another letter. And here the chiddush is that even if he wrote two letters, but since he's sort of writing on top of two other letters, he's just merely reinforcing what's already there, he's not writing anything new, again he's going to be potter for that. A person intended to write one letter. He intended to write the letter ches. Now, in Ksav Ashuris, imagine the Sefer Torah, you see the letter ches. The letter ches is really formed by writing two zayins. Imagine two zayins like that, and a little roof on the top of the two zayins, and that forms a ches. So a person intended to write a letter ches, and he set out and wrote two zayins, but inadvertently he forgot to draw the roof on top of the two zayins, and therefore he's actually written two zayins, two letters. Still he's going to be potter, because he only intended to write one letter, and if the intention was only to write one, therefore he can't be chayiv min haTorah. Now, the Mishnah is now going to list three ways in which, again, a person is going to be potter, and this contrasts with what we learned in the previous Mishnah. The previous Mishnah says that you're only going to be chayiv on Shabbos if the two letters that you wrote are nehegin zeh im zeh, they can be read together. But if a person wrote the letters in a way that they cannot be read together, then he'll be potter. So, for example, echod ba'oretz ve'echod b'korah. If a person wrote one letter on the ground and then one letter on the ceiling, then you can't read them together, and therefore he'll be potter. Or kosev al shnei kosle habayis. If a person wrote two letters on two walls of the house, he wrote one letter on that wall and then another letter on that wall, they can't be read together, and again he's going to be potter. And furthermore, al shnei dapei pinkas. If a person wrote two letters on the ledger, different pages of a ledger, then again he's going to be potter, because they can't be read together. They can't be read together, then potter. Now the Bar Tanura says, al shnei dapei pinkas, says the Bar Tanura, sha'asuyin amudim. You've got a pinkas, you've got some sort of ledger which is made, split up into columns. Kosev ois achas ba'omud zeh. A person wrote one letter on one column, v'ois achas ba'omud zeh, and then he wrote another letter in another column. Ve'eni yochel lekarvan elim kein yachtov yachtoich ma shemafsik beinehem. You can't bring the two letters that you wrote on different columns together unless you cut them out in between, the way then you can draw them together. So if you didn't do that, you can't just bring them together, and therefore it's considered ein negim zeh. They're not they can't be read together. Now, then the Bar Tanura just makes the observation: the Tana bereisha kosli habayis. First of all, the Tana tells me kosli habayis hameruchakim zeh mezeh v'hoda toni pinkas. First of all, it tells me the chiddush of walls of the house which are sort of separate. You're not chayav for that. And even then, it tells me the halach of dapei pinkas v'lo zu afsu ktoni, because the Mishnah, as often it does, it's set out in the form of a lo zu afsu. Not only when the person has written it on the floor and on the ceiling, where it certainly can't be read together, but even if he writes them on two walls, but they can't be read together. But even if a person writes them on one ledger, but since the columns are not adjoining or the letters are not adjoining, therefore a person will be potter. Okay, concludes the Mishnah. Kosev ois achas no trikoin. If a person wrote one letter, but he wrote that one letter as an abbreviation. So the Bar Tanura gives examples. For example, a person wrote the letter kuf, and with that letter kuf he intended to mean carbon, or he wrote the letter mem, and the mem would be mais or tof, truma, for example. So then we have a machlokas. Rabbi Yeshua ben Beseira mechayev. Rabbi Yeshua ben Beseira says you'd be chayev, because after all, that one letter symbolizes a large word, a teva shlema, full word, and therefore you're going to be chayev. That's what Rabbi Yeshua ben Beseira says. The chachomim poitrin, the chachomim say that you're potter, because at the end of the day you didn't write the minimum shir for ksiva, i.e. you didn't write two letters, and therefore even though it stood for a longer word, lemaisa you only wrote one letter, and therefore your potter, and the halach is in fact like the chachomim, that if you write one letter as an abbreviation, that you would in fact be potter. That is the end of Mishnah Hey.